What's up, beautiful people? Today I'd like to be racist again. I really like being racist, in case you didn't know. It's always fun. So, one of the things I've noticed is that, we as a society have decided that racism is bad, but, you know, I don't quite agree actually. I think that racism is an evolved tool that is natural and useful for society. I think there are differences between the races, and I think we should embrace diversity instead of, silencing it. Stereotypes are there for a reason, and there's verifiable evidence of distance or differences between all of the races. For instance, no one questions the Olympics. There's a clear and very present display of what certain races are capable of, how proficient they are. Especially from certain areas, you can definitely see that there's trends, and pretty much at the tip, the differences in the races aren't going to be between the average person. The average human being is going to be average, about as average as every other human being. You're going to see the differences in the races at the extremes, like anything else. It's a bell curve, right? There's extremes here. Certain extremes are going to be a couple standard deviations ahead of other extremes. It's the same thing that's true as far as invention, as far as creativity, as far as physical attributes. Just look at the Olympics, for instance. There are multiple, it's pretty obvious, there are multiple Kenyans that are going to top running as usual due to their phenotype. There are strongest men in the world that are going to do certain things. Just look at the available evidence for, you can see people's ability to computate things, or their intelligence quotient. How good are they at processing information and pattern recognition, which is what an IQ test is. I'm not saying that's general intelligence, but it is pattern recognition. And in most cases, pattern recognition, if you're able to see these things, is going to be, your ability to problem solve. And that's going to assist you. And that's what IQ is. And it's different between the races. There are racial differences. And I think as a society, we need to accept that. I think there's a universal truth that racism is real, and it's an evolved trait, and it was evolved for a reason. The Neanderthals aren't around anymore for a reason, because society, to improve, has to remove bad racial traits from our bodies. Eugenics has said, a lot of people have said eugenics is bunk science, that it's been disproved, but again, I'm not really seeing the evidence against this. Eugenics was used in the wrong way, right? Eugenics was taken by Margaret Sanger and a bunch of American Democrats, and they used it as a means to place Planned Parenthoods on the corner of every single black neighborhood in New York. That's not really fixing the racial gene pool. Specifically trying to keep the black population down is not eugenics, and the science was misused in a sense. And now it's verboten to even describe it, right? To discuss it because of the events of World War II, right? And sort of the termination and if you follow those ideals to their logical conclusions, right? But we haven't actually disproven the logical conclusions, which is the big problem here. We haven't, solved the difference in IQ, the difference in physical aptitude that exists between the races. And we haven't and we haven't made any real excuse for purifying our gene pool. Now, we're at a stage of science where we don't really need to purify our gene pool anymore in that sense. We're at the point where we could splice out bad genes, start, creating synthetic humans, removing things, and, children are preventing bad things from happening in the future through, genetic manipulation of the human DNA code. That's the reality of what the future is. The future is not, racism as an idea is going to die with science because it was a useful, evolved trait. And as we progress further and further throughout humanity, it is eventually going to go away. There will not be a need to be racist anymore. Once, a lot of the aggressive traits, the disagreeable traits in humans are removed through gene splicing. We aren't there yet, but we're going to be there. The same way that, the meat is murder is going to be done away by science, because eventually it's going to be more efficient to just create synthetic meat out of nothing than it is to grow a cow, right? Eventually we're going to get to a point where a lot of our diet is like pills or man-made capsules. I'm talking about, futurism stuff, but human beings are still going to eat like regular food, but within our lifetimes, probably, we're going to see the start of sort of the revolution of what food actually is. Just because of the obesity health epidemic, you can't trust people to control their own weight. So, going forwards, that idea is going to die, much like racism is going to die in the future. Sad but true. But in current day, it still has practical applications. Stereotypes are still very good. The Jews still have their chutzpah. No matter, if you know, you know. If you understand what I'm saying by that, you understand what I'm saying by that. Stereotypes are still useful. And the people that have been, like, for instance, there was that one social justice warrior, Carson, that got stabbed in New York because he, fucked around and found out. He believed the propaganda he was spewing. This guy was a true believer in racial equality. And, he got stabbed at 4 a.m. by a crack addict, and while his girlfriend watched, equality right there, beautiful. And, you could have avoided this if you had if you understood the world properly, if you stopped denying reality. And denying reality has lethal consequences. 41% of trans people attempt suicide is something like, that's the statistic, right? And that number is only going up, despite society bending over backwards to try and please these people, to try and make them more comfortable. Denying reality has serious consequences, And denying the differences between the races has serious, lethal consequences. It has lethal consequences for black people. It was only recently that affirmative action was just gotten rid of, right? And let's be clear here. Affirmative action hurt African American prospects way, way more than it helped them. Let's say you have a top 1% black student, right? This is an amazing future engineer. It happens all the time. But because of affirmative action, this top 1% student goes to Harvard, and he's with a bunch of top 0.1% students. Suddenly he's the dumbest kid in the room, when that kid could do so much with his life. Instead, he drops out of Harvard because, let's face it, he didn't belong there in the first place. But this kid belongs in MIT. This kid still can make it, This kid is a top 1% student still, but he just wasn't a Harvard student. He wasn't a top 0.1%, And so that kid now drops out, and he's a gangbanger in a couple years, right? Look, this story happens all the bloody time, And it's sad but true. That's the result of affirmative action. Affirmative action was meant to keep black people from getting degrees. It's meant to throw them into situations where they're underqualified for what they're trying to do, so they fail. And it was that way since the start. That was the point and purpose of it. And, now that it's gone, that's great. We're undoing a lot of these racial mores and racial failures, but it's going to take a while before that even cycles out of the system. And, at the end of the day, the biggest benefactors of affirmative action were white men. Like, our high-end universities right now should be like 90% Asian. Like, that's the reality of the situation. They're doing the best on tests because they're the best at computations. They have the highest IQs. They're a standard deviation above whites for a reason. And at the high end, that's going to show through. And that's why there's so many Asians at the top of universities. The racial differences are there, they're real, and we're intentionally ignoring them to our own peril. So, it's time to start embracing the differences in all the races. And that's not to say one race is better than the other, right? I'm not saying that. For instance, when you accept that everyone's equal, when you're trying to force equality on people, you have a situation like you have with the Beatles. Like, black people objectively just make the best music. It's been that way since, antiquity. They're just better at rhythm than other races for some reason. Who knows why? Probably genetic. We'll probably understand this in the future at some point. But if you look, all the Beatles did was take black music and then sell it to white people. Like, you can trace the genus of almost all modern music to certain black people that invented it, right? And, if we don't embrace the differences between the races, if we don't start as a society, before we can start splicing our genes and making it irrelevant, and building perfect humans, if we don't start accepting these differences and start embracing them, we're losing them to our own peril. Racism is an evolved trait and evolved for a reason, and it's beneficial to our survival if we are a racist. So be racist. Think about it. It's pretty interesting.